Two puppies came out of the snow before the sun did. One was walking. One was being dragged by the scruff, by the ear, by whatever the first one could get its teeth into. They had come 9 miles through a storm that killed grown men that same week. When I opened my door, the walking one didn't bark. It didn't beg. It looked past me into my cabin at the fire, then back over its own shoulder at the mountain. And it waited. I have been alone in these hills long enough to talk to my coffee. I know an animal asking for food. This was not that. There were 23 children up there. 23. I know the number because 6 weeks earlier I had loaded them into wagons myself and counted them twice, and took my payment and drove home and slept fine. This is the story of what those two pups made me do. It is not a story about how brave I was. It's a story about how long it took me to move. The scratching didn't wake me. The silence after it did. Anything in this country that scratches at a door keeps scratching. Bear, Wolverine, a hungry lion that's forgotten what a man smells like, they commit. This thing scratched twice, weak as a woman knocking on a coffin, and then quit. Quitting is what got my eyes open. In 51 years I have learned that the sounds which stop are the ones worth standing up for. I lay there in the dark and counted. That's a habit of mine. I count things when I'm frightened and I count things when I'm bored, and by now I can't tell those two apart, which my wife would have found funny and did once out loud in a kitchen that no longer exists. 9 seconds, 10, 11. Then a sound low in the wood of the door, like a sigh with a body attached. I got up, put my feet on the cold plank floor, reached for the sharps because a man doesn't stop being a fool just because he's aging, and pulled the bar. The wind shoved the door back at me hard enough to bruise my thumb. Snow came in sideways in a fistful, and the fire behind me flattened out and hissed, and there in the blue-black square of the morning were two dogs. Not dogs, pups, half-growns, 5 months maybe, all leg and no sense, the kind that ranch women give away in a basket because the mother had 8 and the ranch needs 3. One was standing, just barely, a red-brown thing with a white throat and one ear that had folded over and frozen that way, and it was standing with its back legs spread wide like a table with a broken leg, shaking so hard its jaw knocked. The other was on its side in the snow, black and white, not moving, and in the standing one's mouth was a hank of that other one's rough, and the drag marks went back from my step into the dark and up the trail and out of sight in the blowing dark, and they went a distance I could not see the end of. I said something, I don't remember what, some old useless prayer word. The red pup let go of its brother's neck, and I swear before whatever's listening, it looked past me at the fire, a long, dumb, hungry look, the way you'd look at a woman you'd loved 30 years ago across a crowded street, and then it turned its head deliberately, back over its shoulder, uphill. And it waited. That's the part I would like to explain to somebody someday. It did not come inside. There was a fire 8 feet from its face, and it did not come inside. It stood in the doorway of the first warm place it had found in God knows how long, and it looked back up the mountain, and it waited for me to understand. I did not understand, not for a while. Set that against my name however you like. I brought them in, kicked the door shut with my heel, laid the black and white one on the hearthstones and started slapping it, no gentleness in it, just the way you'd slap a newborn calf, hard flat palm along the ribs again. Somewhere in the 3rd minute it made a sound like a cork coming out of a bottle and its back foot kicked, and it began to shiver, which meant it wasn't dead yet, because dead things have the good manners to be still. The red one drank water so fast it choked, and then it stood by the door again, not eating. There was jerked venison in a bowl and it stood by the door. Look, I want to be honest about this in the way that costs something. I sat down. I sat down in my chair with the fire and I dried my hands on my knees and I thought, storm pups. Somebody's stock dogs, run off from a homestead, half drowned, half lost. Damn shame. I'll grain them up and when the weather breaks I'll ride down to Peck's and ask who's missing dogs. And then I would have gone back to bed. That is who I am. I would like a different account of it, but there isn't one. There was a rescue standing in my doorway with a frozen ear, and I was going to grain it up and go back to bed. What stopped me was the collar. It wasn't a collar. It was a strip of red flannel cut from a shirt, wound 3 times around the red pup's neck and knotted, and there was something stiff and folded through the knot, and my hands were shaking when I got it loose. From the cold, I told myself, from the cold, and I unfolded a scrap of stiff paper, wet through, the ink run to purple weather. It was a name tag, the kind they punch and string and hang on a child's coat so the matron knows which one is which. Government paper. It had a number on it. Number 9. And under the number, in a careful, cramped, ruled line hand, the kind a person makes when someone has stood over them with a switch until they made it. Mary, I want to tell you what I did next. What I did next was sit down again, on the floor this time, with my back against the door, and put my hand over my mouth, and make a noise I have not made since the winter my wife went. Because I knew that paper. 6 weeks before, on the 2nd of October, I had hauled freight up from Bowie for the territorial school. 3 wagons. I drove the lead. The pay was good and the road was easy, and I had done it twice before, and I did not think about it. I want that understood. I did not think about it. The freight was children. 23 of them. 16 Apache. 4 Mexican, from a village near the border that had burned in a way nobody would explain to me. 3 white, orphans out of Tucson, tossed in because there was room in the wagon and the school got its money by the head. The white ones and the Mexican ones sat up front near the driver, which was Bill Sowell's rule and not mine. The Apache children rode in back with a canvas tied down over the bows so they couldn't see out, which was also Sowell's rule, and which I did not fight him on because I was tired, and because there was a Miss Ada Pryor riding along from the school, and she said, "It's easier for them this way, Mr. Kell. They don't get so frightened if they can't see it going by." And the numbers were on tags around their necks, because their names, the ones their mothers had given them, were not to be used at the school, so they were given new ones on paper. Number 9 was a girl about 11, skinny all elbows. She had a pup in her coat. She'd smuggled it, half a dog, sticking its nose out through her buttons, and Sowell saw it at the Shenega crossing and went for it, and she folded herself over that animal on the wagon bed and would not be pried apart, and Sowell had his hand back to strike her, and I said, "Bill." Just that. "Bill." And he looked at me and looked at the girl and spat and walked off, and Miss Pryor wrote something in her book. The girl looked up at me. She did not say thank you. She looked at me the way you look at a rock that happened to be in a useful place. And then she went back to the pup, and I saw there were 2 of them, not one, the second one down in the dark of her coat, and I turned around and got back on the box and drove. I never learned her real name. It was not on the paper. It is not on the paper. I have it here on my table right now, drying by the fire, and it says Mary and it says 9, and that is all the world wrote down of her. I counted them out of the wagons at the school gate, 23. I counted twice, that habit again. I signed Sowell's sheet. I took my $40 and I drove home with an empty wagon making that hollow banging sound empty wagons make, and I slept fine. I slept fine. Here is what I did not know, sitting on my floor with that scrap of paper in my fist. I did not know that 11 days ago the school had loaded them up again, all 23, plus Miss Pryor, plus 2 teamsters, to move them to the new agency school at Fort Grant before the winter closed the pass. I did not know they had gone the high road because it was shorter. I did not know a wagon had gone off the shelf at the Devil's Backbone in the first snow, or that the mules had gone with it, or that the road behind them had come down in a slide the same afternoon, sealing the canyon at both ends like a hand closing. I did not know any of that until later. And I am telling it to you now out of order because that is how I got it, in pieces, wrong and too late. What I knew, on my floor at 4 in the morning, was that a child had cut up her shirt to make a collar and had tied her paper name into it, and had sent her dogs down a mountain in a storm. Which meant she had a reason to believe they'd get somewhere. Which meant she was smarter than everyone who had ever put a number on her. I've kept a ledger for 30 years. Not a diary, I'd sooner be shot. A ledger, left column what I spent, right column what I got. Some men pray I balance. I got the ledger down, and I opened to a clean page and I wrote, because my hands needed something to do that wasn't shaking. Nav 19, snow, 2 pups half dead, red one carries the black one. Tag number 9 Mary. And then I sat looking at that and the fire popped, and the red pup put its head against my boot and pushed. Not a nuzzle, a shove, like a man moving a heavy thing that's in his way. I wrote one more line. I do not know how far. Then I closed the book and I got up and started pulling gear off the wall, and my hands stopped shaking, because there is nothing on this earth that steadies a coward like finally having somewhere to put his fear. I had one mule. Her name was Comfort, which was my wife's idea of a joke, and my wife had been dead 9 years, and the joke had aged into something I couldn't laugh at and couldn't rename. Comfort was 15, wide as a stove, and possessed of the single most valuable quality a mountain animal can have, which is a complete and total lack of imagination. Nothing frightened her because nothing occurred to her. I loaded her with what I had: 4 wool blankets, a canvas fly, rope 40 feet and another 20 of lighter line, beans, coffee, sugar, a slab of bacon wrapped in cheesecloth, the sharps and 11 rounds, my axe, a tin of lard and a tin of bag balm because burned and frozen skin want the same thing, matches in a corked bottle, and a second lot in my hatband, because a man who keeps his fire in one place has already decided how he's going to die. And then I stood in the door with the wind taking my breath out of my chest, and I did the arithmetic, and the arithmetic was ugly. Say the pups came from the high country. Say the backbone because that's the only road up there. That's 21 miles by trail and 9 miles as the raven goes, straight up a face that a raven wouldn't bother with. Say I go horseback around and the road's out, and I lose 2 days finding that out. Say I go straight up, and the storm doesn't quit, and I'm a 51-year-old man with a knee that's been wrong since Chickamauga. Say I get there. 23 children and 1 mule in a canyon with the road down. I could not do it. I want you to understand that with your whole body. I stood in that door and I did the sums, and there was no version of it where a man alone got 23 children off that mountain alive. And I went anyway, because the alternative was to stand in my own house for the rest of my life. That's not courage, whatever the man at the newspaper wrote later. Courage is a thing you have before you go. What I had was a house I couldn't stand in anymore. The red pup would not ride. I tried, lifted him up into the pannier basket, and he came out of it like a trout, hit the snow and started up the trail. Fell, got up, went on. He'd made 9 miles down and he was going to make 9 miles back up, and he was 5 months old and he weighed maybe 20 pounds, and I have never in my life been so thoroughly shamed by anything with 4 legs. The black and white one, the dragged one, could not stand. So I opened my coat and put him inside against my shirt and buttoned it over him, and he lay there with his head under my chin, and for the first 2 hours he was so cold I couldn't tell if he was breathing. And then somewhere on the switchbacks above the creek I felt something on my collarbone. He was licking me, slow, once every long while. I said, "Quit it." He kept on. I said, "I mean it." He kept on, and I cried a while up there where nobody could see, which is one of the 2 or 3 good arguments for living alone. Now I have to tell about Nayland, and I have to be careful, because I have known white men who tell stories about Apache people the way they tell stories about weather, as a thing that happened to them. She had been following me for an hour before I knew it. I found that out when I stopped to breathe at the top of the third switchback and heard my mule's breath and my breath, and then a third breath, off to the left in the rocks that stopped a half-second after mine did. A woman's trick. A hunter's trick. Match your breathing to your quarry's and he'll never hear the difference. I kept my hands where they were. I said to the rocks, "You're welcome to the fire when I make one." Nothing for maybe a minute. Then she came out of the scrub about 30 feet upslope, and she had a rifle, and it was not pointed at me, but it was not pointed anywhere else either. She was maybe 35. Deerskin leggings, a man's canvas coat far too big, a wool scarf wrapped over her head and jaw so only the eyes showed, and those eyes were red-rimmed and swollen in a way I recognized from my own mirror in the winter of '77. She had been going without sleep for a long time. Days of it. She looked at the pup's head sticking out of my coat. And she made a sound, not a word, a short, cut-off sound in her throat like someone stepping on a nail and refusing to give it the satisfaction. "Where?" she said. Her English was flat and careful, and I understood later that she spoke it better than she let on, and that letting on is a thing that can get you killed. "Where you find him?" "My door this morning, there's two." I opened my coat wider so she could see the black and white one. "This one didn't walk it. The red one dragged him 9 miles. She came down the slope. She did not lower the rifle, and I did not ask her to. She stood in front of me, she came up to my chin, and she looked at the pup in my coat and put out one bare hand and touched its nose with 2 fingers, very lightly. Then she said a name, not English, 2 syllables soft with a little catch on the second. And she said, "My daughter's dogs." The wind blew and my mule shifted her feet, and somewhere below us, the creek was running under ice with a sound like a crowd in another room. "Number 9, I said. My voice went somewhere I hadn't sent it. "The tag says." "Do not," she said, "say that number to me." I shut my mouth. She stood there with her hand on the pup's nose, and I watched a thing happen in her eyes that I have no business describing, and then it was over and she stepped back and pulled her scarf up. "You are the driver," she said. I said yes. "You put the canvas over them." "So I did." "You drove the wagon." The wind went right through my coat and out the other side. "Yes," I said, "I drove the wagon." She looked at me for a long time. Long enough that I thought about the rifle. Long enough that some cold part of me thought she'd be within her rights, and some warmer part thought about how I'd never gotten around to fixing the pump. Then she turned uphill and said, "Your mule is too fat for the backbone. Bring her anyway. We will need what she carries and we will not need her after." And she walked, and I followed her, which is a sentence that took me 40 years to be able to write without flinching. Her name, I learned in pieces over 2 days, was Nailin. Her daughter was 11. The pups had come from a Mexican woman's litter at the agency. The girl had begged them and hidden them and been beaten for them and hidden them again. Nailin had not seen her daughter in 14 months. She had walked to the school twice, both times more than 60 miles, and both times been turned back at the gate by a man with a book who explained that visits were disruptive to the children's progress. She had been on the mountain 8 days. She had found the slide that closed the lower road, and she had climbed the ridge above it, and she had seen, through a break in the storm from 3 miles off, for maybe the length of a breath, a smudge of smoke in the canyon. And she could not get down to it. That's the part she said last, and she said it looking straight ahead. She had tried the north face and it was ice. She had tried the notch and there was 40 feet of overhang. She had gone 8 days without proper food, and she had eaten snow because a fire would have brought the wrong people, and she had circled that canyon like a moth on a lampshade knowing her child was under her feet. Then she'd cut down toward the lowlands to find rope, any rope, and found instead the dog tracks in fresh snow coming down. "I followed them to you," she said. "You could have come to my door." She glanced at me just once. It was not unkind, and that was somehow worse. "No," she said, "I could not." Here is what the devil's backbone is, for those who have never had the pleasure. It's a ridge of rotten sandstone about a mile long, and the road cut into its flank is 9 feet wide in the good places. On the uphill side, a wall. On the downhill side, 400 feet of air, and then the Aravaipa cutting its way through the bottom of a canyon that never gets full daylight. The road goes out onto the backbone and comes back off it, and there is no other way through. And every man who's driven it has a story about a wagon he saw go, or nearly saw go. The snow had brought the wall down. Not all of it, that's what makes it cruel. Just about 90 feet of it dumped over the roadbed and off into space, leaving a scar of raw wet sandstone and a gap you could not cross with mules or wagons or hope. And on the far side, past the slide, the road ran on for a half-mile and then dropped in a set of hairpins into the canyon bottom, where the smoke was. We got to the near lip of the slide at dusk on the second day. The storm had blown itself down to nothing but a fine white sift and a wind that came up out of the canyon smelling of wet stone and juniper. I have thought a great deal about what I saw when I looked down. 400 feet below, near the frozen edge of the Aravaipa, there was a wagon, or what a wagon becomes. Yellow wood scattered on gray rock in a fan shape like something dropped by a bird. 2 mules, dead so long the ravens had lost interest. And 100 yards downstream, under an overhang of black rock, a fire. A little fire. A stupid little fire, barely a fire at all, throwing its smoke up in a thin gray line that the canyon wind kept snatching sideways. And around it, shapes. I got my glass out. My hands were unsteady with the cold, and I had to brace the barrel of it on Comfort's pack. And I looked down that long tube of trembling gray light, and I counted. I counted a fire, and a canvas fly rigged from wagon sheet, and something that was maybe a shelter of stacked brush. I counted a woman in a black dress sitting with her back against the rock, absolutely motionless, and I could not tell, and I looked for a long time whether she was alive. And I counted children. 1, 4, 7, 9, 12 in a huddle under the fly so tangled together I had to count the boots. 15, 18, a tall boy carrying wood. 19, 20, 2 little ones by the fire. 22. I looked again. I made myself go slow. I started at the left-hand edge of the overhang, and I moved the glass a hand's width at a time, and I counted boots and heads and the small dark shapes of shoulders, and I did it 3 times, and the 3rd time I did it out loud, because Nayland was standing at my elbow with her breath going in and out like a bellows, and she had asked me, without words, to please say a number. 22. 22. I lowered the glass. My eyes were streaming from the cold and the strain, and I wiped them on my sleeve and looked again and got 22 again, and my heart was making a noise in my ears like a hammer on a fence post. 23 had gone up that road. Nayland took the glass out of my hands. She did not ask for it. She put it to her eye, and she was very still, and the little muscles at her jaw kept moving under her scarf, and the wind pushed at us both. "The girl who sent the dogs," she said. "Nayland. She is not there." She said it flat. She said it the way you'd read a number off a scale. And then the red pup, who had walked 9 miles down and 18 miles back, and had not eaten anything I could persuade him to eat. The red pup went to the very lip of that slide, where the rock was rotten and the drop was 400 feet of nothing, and he put his nose down at a place in the snow, and he whined. Not at the fire, not down at the canyon bottom where the 22 were. At a place on our side of the gap, up under the wall. I got down on my knees, which cost me something with that knee, and I put my face where his face was, and there in the snow, half filled and softened and nearly gone, was the print of a small shoe. Going up. The print was going up, and it was small, and it was alone. I put my thumb beside it in the snow to measure, and my thumb was nearly as long as the shoe. Nayland knelt on the other side of it and did not put her hand anywhere near it, and I understood that too. after a second. You don't touch a thing you're afraid will come apart. 11 years old, I said. She'd not climb up, she'd climb down, toward the fire, toward the people. Nayland said, then you have not met her. There's a thing that happens to a man's arithmetic when the numbers stop behaving. I'd counted 22 heads at the bottom of a canyon and one shoe on the wrong side of a slide, and the two figures would not reconcile, and I stood on that rotten lip in the dying light and felt my whole way of standing in the world tilt about 4 degrees. Because the road below was where the people were. The people were where warmth was, and food, and whatever the woman in the black dress was doing to keep 22 children breathing for 11 days. And the girl had gone the other way. The red pup had his nose down and was working uphill along the base of the wall. In the strip of snow the wind had scoured thin, and I let him work and I followed, and Nayland came behind with her rifle across her back now, both hands free. 400 yards on, the wall broke into a chimney, a crack running up the sandstone maybe 90 feet, with chalkstones wedged in it and a fringe of dead juniper roots hanging out like a bad haircut. And going up the chimney, on the powdered ledges where the snow lay, on the flat of a chalkstone, in a smear where a mitten had gone across wet rock and left a fiber of red wool, her. Nayland put her hand on the rock. She didn't say anything. I looked at that chimney with the eyes of a 51-year-old man who once fell 9 feet off a hay wagon and lay in the barn a full minute wondering if he was dead. 90 feet. Rotten stone. Ice in the back of the crack. She got them up there, I said. And then I heard myself say it and I understood it and it went through me like a swallow of raw whiskey. God Almighty. She carried them up there. Because you cannot send a dog down a 400-foot cliff. You cannot send a dog through a slide that has taken the road out from under it. There was one way off that mountain for anything with 4 legs, and it was not down to the fire, and it was not back along the ruined road. It was up, over the shoulder, onto the ridge and down the long north slope on the far side, which drops in 11 miles of broken timber and scree, and eventually, if a creature is stubborn beyond all sense, arrives at the door of a man named Amos Kell. She had figured that out. 11 years old in a canyon in the snow, with a broken wagon and a dying teacher and 22 other children, she had looked at the whole shape of the mountain in her head and found the single thread that led out of it. And the thread was too narrow for anything but a dog. We climbed in the last of the light, and then we climbed in no light at all. Nayland went first, and I want to say something about that which will sound like a small thing. She went first, and every 10 or 12 feet she stopped and reached back down without looking, and her hand would be there in the dark at exactly the height my hand was, every time, as though she had measured me once at the bottom and would not need to do it again. I am not a good climber. I got about halfway and my knee locked, and I put my forehead against the cold rock and made a sound. Her hand came down. You are heavy, she said, and you are old, and I am not going to pull you. Then why's your hand there? So you will know where the rock is. I have thought about that more than I've thought about most sermons. Comfort we left below, tied loose in the lee of the wall with her pack half off her so she could roll if she had to, and I told her we'd be back, and I meant it at the time. The black and white pup rode in my coat the whole way. I felt his heart going against my ribs, quick and light, all the way up that chimney, like a second heart I'd been issued for the occasion. The red one climbed on his own. Twice he came off a ledge and caught himself with his chest and hauled up scrabbling and did not make a sound. He was 5 months old. I want that written somewhere. We came out on the shoulder of the ridge at what must have been 10 at night, into a wind that took the breath right out of your open mouth, and the sky had cleared, and there was a moon. You could see the whole world, the canyon black below and full of nothing, the long white spine of the backbone, the Aravaipa a thread of silver, stars all the way down to the rim of the earth in every direction. So many that the constellations drowned in them. And 30 feet from the top of the chimney, In a scoop of rock where the wind had thrown adrift and then hollowed it out again, was a shape. She had made a nest. She'd broken juniper and laid it in a ring, not for a fire, she'd had no fire, but for a wall. She'd pulled her arms inside her coat and her knees up under it and made herself into the smallest possible object. Her coat had no sleeves. She had cut them off. The flannel around the red pup's neck was a strip from a sleeve of a shirt, and the rest of that shirt was gone too, and I found out later she had it wound around her feet inside her boots, and her arms she had simply given to the cold. She had been on that ridge 4 nights. Nayland got to her first, and I stayed back and the wind blew. I want to be truthful about the next part. There was no cry. There was no running. Nayland knelt in that drift and put her 2 hands on either side of her daughter's face, and she said one word twice, and the second time her voice cracked in half. And the girl's eyes came open, slow, frost in her lashes. She looked at her mother for a long moment. And she said, "Mary." Nayland went absolutely still. "I'm Mary," the girl said in English, in the flat, careful, drilled English of a schoolroom, the voice of a child who has learned exactly what happens if she gets it wrong. "I'm Mary. I'm number 9. I'm sorry. I have been in a battle. I have watched a man I liked come apart in a field in Georgia, and I have carried what was left of him in a shelter half. And I have never in my life heard anything as bad as a child apologizing for her own name to her own mother." Nayland did not weep. She said the girl's name again and again, low into her hair, the real one, the 2 soft syllables with the catch at the end, and she rocked her. And after a while the girl said something back, not English, 3 words, hesitant, the way you'd test a stare you'd been told was rotten. Then she started to cry, and it went on for a long while, and I turned my back and watched the stars and let her have it. The pups had gone straight into her lap. The red one was licking her wrists where the skin had split. Her name, since I have not the right to keep it from you, but she has the right to keep it from most. I'll say it as it sounded to me. Sana. Something in it about standing. Her mother called her that, and I never once heard it come out of a white mouth without damage, including my own, so at the school and in the newspaper afterward she stayed Mary. And I have stopped correcting people, and I am ashamed of that in a small, ongoing way, like a stone in a boot you've decided to live with. Her hands were the worst of it. The last 2 fingers of the left were gone white and hard past the second joint. The right was better. I had the bag balm and the lard, and I did what I knew, which was not much, which was to keep them from thawing and refreezing, and to not rub them, whatever every fool on the frontier will tell you. She would not let go of the blackened white pup, not to be carried, not to be wrapped. He'd nearly died in my coat, and she held him against her stomach with 2 ruined hands and would not. She told it in pieces, over an hour, while we got a fire going out of the juniper wall she'd built to keep from dying. The wagon went off at the backbone on the 8th day of the storm. The rear one. She'd been in the middle wagon, and she'd seen the mules go out into the air with their legs still walking. 2 teamsters, both dead, and a boy named Felix who was 8 and had been made to ride and back that morning as a punishment for something. 23 had gone up the road. 22 had come to the canyon floor. I had counted right. That was the arithmetic. I'd counted right, and I'd been wrong about what the number meant, which I have since learned is the usual case with numbers. Then the slide came down behind them at dusk and sealed the road, and the wagon that was left could not turn, and they went forward and down the hairpins to the canyon floor, because down was the only direction the mountain would still give them. And Miss Ada Pryor, who had ridden the box in a black dress and written in her book when a girl would not surrender a dog, took the 22 children under an overhang of black rock beside a frozen river and kept them alive for 11 days. Let me be exact about what she did, because the country decided later that she was a saint, and she was not, and the truth is harder to carry and worth more. She had 11 days of provisions for 2 teamsters and herself. She made it stretch by eating nothing after the 4th day. She had the wagon sheet, and she made a shelter of it. She had matches, and she made fire, and she kept it small because a big fire eats wood, and there was no wood to speak of, only what the tall boy could break out of the ice at the river's edge. She had a bad hip and no way up the hairpins. She had 4 blankets. There were 22 children. She gave the blankets to the youngest, and she took the boots off her own feet and gave them to a Mexican girl of 6 whose shoes had come apart. And she sat with her back to the rock in her stocking feet for 11 days and did not once come near the fire, because the fire was for the children, and there was not room for everyone. And when the tall boy, his name was Cassador, he was 15, said he would climb out and go for help, she forbade it, and he tried anyway, and she caught him and struck him across the face with her open hand and screamed at him until he sat down. Because she believed, wrongly, that no one could climb out. She was wrong. She was wrong by 1 child and by 4 days and by 2 dogs. Sana had gone up the chimney at night with a pup inside her coat and climbed down and gone back up with the second one, because she couldn't carry both. She'd done that chimney 4 times. She'd cut her shirt and tied her name to the red one, because if the dogs came to any door at all, the dogs could not speak, and she had learned very thoroughly by then that in this country a person is only real if there is paper. And she had not told Miss Pryor she was going, because Miss Pryor would have forbidden it. And when the snow slabbed off under her on the last descent and took the lower 30 feet of the chimney with it, she sat down in a hollow on the ridge and pulled her arms in and waited, and did not shout, and did not throw herself off, and was still there 4 nights later when her mother put 2 hands on her face. That is the girl. That is the whole of it. The papers called her the little Indian maid, and I have never been able to read past the 4th line. We got her down at dawn, on the rope, which is a story I'll not tell because it was ugly and I was useless in it, and Nayland did all of it. Comfort was where I left her. I have been asked whether it was hard, and it was, and I don't intend to dwell. The gap in the road was 90 feet and the rope was 60, and the drop into the canyon from the far side was another matter entirely. We did not cross. We could not cross. I want that plainly stated, because for years afterward men in Bowie bought me drinks under the impression that I had, and I took the drinks, which is its own kind of theft. What we did was smaller. We stood on the lip and I shot the sharps into the air, 3 times spaced, and I did it again a quarter hour later and again. And at the 4th round of it a boy came out from under the black rock and stood in the open, 400 feet below, a stick figure, and looked up. And Nayland took the wagon sheet, I mean the canvas fly off Comfort's pack, and unrolled it on the snow, and we weighted the corners with stone, and she took out a tin of bag balm and used the last of my lard and made a mess of it, and she wrote, in strokes as long as a man is tall, in grease that the sun would show black on white canvas from a mile away, 1 word. Coming. I've thought about the choice of it since. Not help, not food, not a name, not a number, not a promise of a day. She was a woman who had stood at a gate twice, 60 miles each way, and been told her daughter was making progress. She knew what a person needs to hear. We watched through the glass. The boy stood a long while. Then he turned and ran under the rock, and after a minute they came out. I could not count them. My hands were going. They came out in a stumbling clot into the light, 22 of them, and 1 figure being carried between 2 of the bigger ones, a woman in black with nothing on her feet. And they stood in the snow at the bottom of that canyon and looked up at a word. I got down to Peck's on the 3rd day. It took 4 days more to bring men, and rope, and mules, and a doctor, and a man from the newspaper who came ahead of the doctor, which tells you what you need to know about the newspaper. All 22 came out, every one. It has been called a miracle, and it was not. It was a woman with a bad hip who did not eat for 7 days and did not sit near a fire. Ada Pryor lost both feet at the ankle. She sat up in the bed at Bowie and answered the newspaperman's questions in a level voice, and when he asked her whether she'd had faith the children would be saved, she said she had not, and he did not print that. She lived another 19 years. She never went back to the school and she never said why. She wrote to me twice. The second letter had one line in it that I've kept and won't share. The boy Felix is under the rock at the foot of the backbone and there is no marker. And I have been up there twice with a shovel and both times the ground was frozen. And I am running out of years in which the ground will not be frozen. Tsena lost 2 fingers. The school claimed her. There was a document and men in an office, and it took Nayland and me and a lawyer named Ochoa out of Tucson 11 months, and we lost. And then a thing happened that I do not fully understand to this day involving the same newspaperman, and we won. They live in a place I am not going to write down. I have my ledger open on the table. Left column, what I spent. Right column, what I got. That's how I've kept it since I was 20, and it has always balanced because I have always made sure to want only the things I could pay for. $40, October the 2nd. 23 children, counted twice, delivered to a gate. A mule named Comfort. A knee, some pride, 6 weeks of sleeping fine. And on the right, I've sat here an hour, on the right I have got a red pup that would not eat until I stood up. A hand in the dark at exactly the height of my hand. A word on a canvas in bare grease. 2 syllables with a catch in them. It doesn't go in the columns. There's no place I can put it where it adds. I keep thinking about her sitting in that drift with her arms pulled in, on the top of the mountain, in the moonlight, 400 feet above everyone who loved her, having done the only thing that could be done and knowing it might not work. Not shouting, that's what gets me. 4 nights and she never once shouted for help. She'd already learned it doesn't come. The dogs are on my floor tonight. Nayland sends them up with a boy from the Mexican family every fall and takes them back in spring, which is a fiction we all maintain for reasons nobody has ever said out loud. The red one is gray around the muzzle now. I have not written the last line of this. I have started it 4 times. It's just that when I opened the door that morning, he looked past me at the fire, and then he looked back up the mountain and he waited. And I have never in my life been so slow, too.